Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another Friday night live stream. I'm Rod Saunders from Jew and Greek, and this is Friday, January 3rd in the year of our Lord 2025. Happy New Year, everybody. I have a little bit of a problem with my audio here. I'm not hearing myself right. So let me see if I can make an adjustment here real quick. Let me know if I'm not coming through, if you would, please. As you probably could tell from the thumbnail, I'm going to be talking about President Jimmy Carter tonight. That may not be the most popular topic. I'm not going to spend the whole hour talking about Jimmy Carter. I'll take some questions on other topics as we get into the live stream, probably a half hour in or so. But I just felt that for the benefit of you, those of you who are younger, who don't remember Jimmy Carter like I do, I thought I would, this is the kind of thing that you think about as you get older, is what you can pass on to the next generation and share your experience in life and your acquired knowledge with other people. And I remember Jimmy Carter very well. That was the first election I ever voted in was 1976, Gerald Ford versus Jimmy Carter. Thank you, Catastrophic Cannon. He says, it looks and sounds good. That's always good to get that kind of feedback from everybody. Ava Greenfeather, welcome. Before you can really understand Jimmy Carter's presidency, you have to understand what was happening in American politics at the time. We had come through, well, first you had the Kennedy assassination in 1963, and then the escalation into the Vietnam War and the counter war, the counter-establishment, counterculture movement that resisted the war and everything. You had the civil rights movement. And in the midst of all that chaos, Richard Nixon got elected in 1968, and he was reelected in a landslide in 1972 against George McGovern. And then 2 years later, Watergate. And if you don't know what Watergate was about, well, Watergate, a lot of people don't understand what Watergate was about. But what happened was some people who were part of Nixon's reelection committee were found breaking into an office in the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. They were trying to get information that they could use against George McGovern in the 1972 campaign, which makes no sense because there was no way that George McGovern was going to win that election. He lost in a landslide, like I said, but they didn't know that at the time, and they were afraid that if this commie, George McGovern, this bleeding heart liberal, got into the White House, it could be devastating for the country. So they wanted to find something on McGovern. They ended up just getting busted for breaking in, and then that eventually was traced back to Nixon. Now, they never proved that Nixon authorized it or ordered it, the break-in, but he apparently did try and cover it up once it was brought to his attention, and that was considered obstruction of justice. And so Nixon got him, well, he was going to be impeached, but before the impeachment proceedings began, some Republicans in Congress came to Nixon and said, because Nixon was very popular when he was reelected in 1972, but what happened was during the Watergate hearings, they found out that Nixon recorded all of his conversations in the Oval Office. So they told him, hand over your tapes. We want to hear what was on those tapes. And Nixon said no. He claimed executive privilege. He said it's a matter of national security. You don't need to know what's on those tapes. And so they went back and forth, and finally it went to the courts, and then ultimately the Supreme Court, I think it was the Supreme Court ruling that said he had to hand over the tapes. And so he did. And once those tapes were turned over, people heard Nixon cursing like a sailor. And see, Nixon had this reputation. He grew up as a Quaker, a Christian, and he was good friends with Billy Graham. And so the Christian community thought Nixon was one of them. And then when they heard him cursing like that, they said, well, this guy isn't what we thought he was at all. And so his support among the Christian evangelical world dropped drastically. And of course, the Washington establishment never liked Nixon. The press didn't like him, and his poll numbers were just tanking. And as a result, the Republicans went to him and said, you're not taking us down with you. We're not going to support you. And so Nixon knew at that point that he was going to be impeached and he would probably be removed from office. So rather than go through all that, he just resigned in 1974. And he selected Gerald Ford as his vice president, which, that's another story in and of itself, because Nixon's original vice president was Spiro Agnew. Agnew got caught up in his own scandal and resigned, and so Nixon replaced him with Gerald Ford. He thought it was a brilliant move because Gerald Ford, everybody liked Gerald Ford in Congress. And so he knew that Ford would be easily nominated. But he thought Ford had this reputation of not being real bright. And he thought, yeah, they'll be okay with him being vice president, but they're going to think long and hard about impeaching me and making him president because he ain't that bright. LBJ once said that Gerald Ford played football without a helmet. Gerald Ford was a football star in college, played for University of Michigan. And his team won the championship 2 years in a row. So he was kind of a celebrity from the college world, from college football. And then he ran for Congress and he was elected. But he just had this reputation not being real smart. LBJ said, that boy's been playing football without a helmet. Anyway, even though he had this reputation of not being that bright, Nixon resigned and Gerald Ford became president, the first unelected president we ever had. He wasn't elected as vice president or president. He was just nominated and approved, and then Nixon resigned and he became the president. And then 2 years later, he ran against Jimmy Carter when Carter got the nomination for the Democrats. Now, in that 2 years that Ford was president, he pardoned Nixon because there were people that wanted to bring criminal charges against him instead of just an impeachment. Impeachment is a political process. It's not a criminal process. But there were people who wanted to charge him criminally. And so they were putting together criminal cases against him. And Gerald Ford put an end to that by issuing Nixon a complete pardon, which history seems to indicate was a good thing to do to get the country beyond Watergate. But at the time, it really hurt Gerald Ford's popularity in the polls, and it probably cost him the presidency. So anyway, Carter ran on this platform of restoring integrity to government. I shall restore morality to government. And, because we'd been through Kennedy and LBJ and then Nixon and Watergate, and everybody knew LBJ was a crook. And Kennedy, by this time, it was well known that Kennedy had been a womanizer and that he was using drugs and everything. And then, of course, we got lied to about the Vietnam War, and the country just felt like we don't have anybody of integrity in government. Well, Carter was a Sunday school teacher at his Baptist church. And he told everybody he was a born-again Christian, and he taught the Bible in Sunday school, and he really had a lot of appeal with evangelicals because of that. Now, you have to understand, back in the 70s, you didn't have this galvanization behind the Republican Party among the evangelicals like you do today. Back then, Christian evangelicals were split between Democrat and Republican. And because Carter said he was a born-again Christian and a Sunday school teacher in a Baptist church, a lot of Christians voted for him. Gerald Ford was an Episcopalian. They don't really talk about being born again. At least they didn't back then in the Episcopalian Church. So the Episcopalians didn't have as much appeal with evangelicals as the Baptists. Anyway, Carter won the presidency on a platform of integrity. He said, "I will never lie to you." And as far as we can tell, he never lied to the American people about policy, and there was no scandal in Carter's 4 years as president. So a lot of people today revere Jimmy Carter as a man of integrity and character and everything. And like I said, as far as policy, I think that was the case. But as far as being a politician, not necessarily. I'm old enough to remember the debates between Carter and Reagan in 1980 and 1980 was their debate. 84 was the Reagan's debates against Carter's running mate, Walter Mondale, who got the nomination in 84. But anyway, when he was campaigning against Jimmy Carter, or when Carter was campaigning against Reagan in 1980, he was misrepresenting Reagan's record. He said something about Governor Reagan, because Reagan was governor of California. He said, Governor Reagan says that taxes went down when he was governor of California. But the fact of the matter is taxes went up. Tax revenues went up. And Reagan came back and he said, the revenues went up because the population went up. But the per capita tax rate went down. And that's what I was referring to, is the per capita tax rate. I wasn't talking about the total revenues. Yes, that went up because the population grew considerably while I was governor of California. So it made, I think, Carter look very bad, because his attempt at misrepresenting Reagan's record failed. And then there was the 1980... well, I think they had two debates. They had two debates. And then the second one was where they were talking about Medicare. And let me share this with you. I got this pulled up here. Share screen. There we go. The second debate between Reagan and Carter of the 1980 presidential election year was held October 28th, a week before Election Day, by the League of Women Voters. At one point, Carter went on the offensive against Reagan's record regarding Medicare. President Carter: these constant suggestions that the basic Social Security system should be changed does call for concern and consternation among the aged of our country. I'm going to quit imitating him. It is obvious that we should have a commitment to them, that Social Security benefits would not be taxed, and that there would be no peremptory change in the standards by which Social Security payments are made to retired people. Governor Reagan, as a matter of fact, began his political career campaigning around this nation against Medicare. Now we have an opportunity to move toward national health insurance with an emphasis on the prevention of disease, an emphasis on outpatient care, not inpatient care, an emphasis on hospital cost containment to hold down the cost of hospital care. So it goes on and on. And then Howard K. Smith, the moderator, says, Governor, asking Governor Reagan for a response. And Reagan's response was, there you go again. He says, when I opposed Medicare, there was another piece of legislation meeting the same problem before the Congress. I happened to favor the other piece of legislation and thought that it would be better for the senior citizens and provide better care than the one that was finally passed. I was not opposing the principle of providing care for them. I was opposing one piece of legislation versus another. Boom, mic drop. And this kind of solidified Carter's reputation as a bit of a fibber when it came to campaigning. So maybe he didn't lie to the American people as president. I mean, as far as policy and everything, but as a campaigner, as a candidate for re-election, yeah, he lied about Reagan's record, and he got caught on it. And I'm not saying this. I don't want you to think, as I go through this information tonight, I don't want you to think I'm just bashing Carter, because Carter did some good things. But when a person like Carter, a president, dies, the media wants to talk about all the good, and they want to make this person into an angel. And I think it's good to have a different perspective on this. Carter was a politician, and he was not beyond doing things like politicians do to get votes, to get elected. So yes, he was a good man. And I mean, he was, as far as we know, no scandals in his presidency, no scandals in his personal life. He was happily married. I mean, my goodness, they were married for like 75 years or something. She passed away a couple of years ago, and then he died Sunday at the age of 100. Longest longevity of a president in American history. So anyway, Carter got elected, and his presidency was fraught with troubles, international troubles, economic troubles. Well, let me just start off with stagflation. If you've never heard of stagflation, we had a big problem with inflation when Gerald Ford was president in the mid 70s. Inflation got up to, I think, like 18%, something like that. It was just crazy. And so Carter ran on partly on a platform of bringing inflation down. He didn't accomplish much. And in fact, we had what we called stagflation, which stagflation means when there's a lot of inflation in the economy, the prices are going up, but the economy is still growing. People are still working. Stagflation is when prices are still going up, but the economy isn't growing. And that's even worse, because now you got to pay more for goods and services, but a lot of people are unemployed. Unemployment rate is going up. So Carter was seen as a guy who just did not know how to manage the economy. Another thing, under Carter's leadership, the top marginal tax rate, I'll pull it up here for you. The top marginal tax rate. Oh, I got to pull up. Okay, I didn't have the graphic on that. I had graphic on other stuff. It was around 70% under Carter. It was back in the 50s, the top marginal tax rate, because, we have a graduated tax system where people who make $1 million a year pay a higher percentage in taxes. Back in the 50s, the top marginal tax rate was like 90%. That's just nuts. That's insane. Under Carter, the top rate was 70%. Under Reagan, it was brought down to about 50%. Reagan's policy was what we called supply-side economics. The critics called it trickle-down economics or Reaganomics. But the idea is by reducing the tax rates, more revenues will be generated to the federal government because more jobs are created, more businesses are created, and the economy is growing. And I was a Reagan guy. I voted for Reagan twice, and I voted for Gerald Ford in 1976 because I just believe in lower taxes, strong military, and just basic conservative principles. And I'm going to show you here a chart of what the economy did during, over the past. Yeah, there's the Dow. You guys see that okay? The Dow Jones Industrial Averages. You can see, and this is, let me pull this up on a different screen here. You can see this is 1954. The Dow was at 3911. This is 1984, 3582. Now that is 30 years from 54, 64, 74, 84. That's 30 years. And the Dow was actually lower. I mean, yeah, it went up, but then it came back down, but it really wasn't going anywhere. It would go up and down, up and down. And then 1984, March of 84, that was about the time that Reagan's, well, his second term started in 85, but his economic policies began to kick in. And we've pretty much been on a bull run ever since because supply side economics works. Keeping the top marginal tax rate down to give people incentive to buy stuff, to invest, it grows the economy. And the more the economy grows, the more people are working and paying taxes to the federal government. Now, some people say, well, yeah, it failed because the deficits went up, the national debt went up. Well, that's not the result of revenues. If the revenues are going up, then the deficits are going up because of spending, not because of a lack of revenues. And I'm not going to get into a whole lot of economics here, but I'm just pointing out that that was the big thing that sold the American people on Reagan, and he was reelected in 84 in a landslide because people saw that this works. And the economy has been growing pretty much. I mean, we've had a few recessions here and there, but as I showed you from the Dow chart, it just kept overall the trend for the last 40 years has been up. So that's why I voted for Reagan, one of many reasons. And that's why I think Carter is known as a weak president, is because he did not know how to manage the economy. And as foreign policy goes, we had the Iranian hostage crisis, and we had Americans held captive in Tehran, Iran, for a year or so. And Carter sent a military rescue operation in, and it ended in disaster. The helicopter crashed, and he was just seen as weak on national security and foreign policy. Well, weak on national security. He did have a big foreign policy victory when he arranged the Camp David Accord between Israel and Egypt. And if you're not as old as me, you don't remember, but there was a time when peace between Egypt and Israel seemed impossible. They were mortal enemies. But the leader of Israel was Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin was a former Israeli fighter, and Anwar Sadat was the leader of Egypt, and he was a former Egyptian fighter. And now they were both heads of state, and they were older, and they said, let's stop fighting. Let's have peace between our countries. And so Carter brought them to Washington, or to America, and they went to Camp David, and they hammered out the Camp David peace accords, and it has lasted now for 45 years. The greatest accomplishment of Jimmy Carter's presidency. I will give him credit for that, even though I've never been a supporter of Jimmy Carter. That was just inconceivable when I was a kid, that Israel and Egypt would have peace. It was just like the Soviet Union. Who could have imagined the Soviet Union would collapse when I was a kid? But it happened around 1990. So anyway, but that was his one foreign policy accomplishment. His policies with Iran and the Muslim nations overall was disastrous, because our ally, the Shah of Iran, was deposed, and they replaced him with Ayatollah Khomeini. And all of a sudden, Iran and most of the Muslim nations in the Middle East went from a Western style of dress and culture to fundamentalism. And I'm going to show you a picture here of Osama bin Laden. Some of you may never have seen this, but I think it's important that people see this photo. This is old man bin Laden. He had like 3 or 4 wives. Muslims, they do that. And so these are his kids from his different wives. They're on a ski trip in Europe. The girls are wearing pants and makeup. Okay. The boys are wearing bell bottoms and paisley. This with the red circle, that's Osama bin Laden when he was 14 years old. All of them were very Western. They listened to the Beatles. They dressed like Americans. They were into American culture. Now, eventually, of course, Osama bin Laden was caught up in radical Islam and terrorism. But before Jimmy Carter, that's the way it was in the Middle East. A lot of these countries were friendly with the United States. But because Carter wouldn't stand by our ally, the Shah of Iran, and he just said, well, it's none of our business who their leader is in Iran. That's for them to determine. Well, if we invested billions of dollars in Iran, showing them how to drill, how to find the oil, drill for oil, and ship it, refine it, market it, distribution, all of that stuff, we'd invested billions of dollars over there in those different countries. And so it was just kind of our policy is, yes, it is our business who's in control of the country because we've invested a lot of money in your countries. But Carter didn't do anything. The Shah was kicked out. The Ayatollah took over, and all that money that we'd invested in oil exploration, production, and refining, all of that just fell into the hands of enemies of the United States. So this is why Carter, when people said Carter was a bad president, well, it was this kind of stuff that he was all about peace. He was a man of peace, but sometimes you got to show strength. Sometimes you got to make tough decisions and see the long-term implications of pacifism. So anyway, Carter's popularity just plummeted, and he lost by the biggest landslide of any incumbent president in my lifetime. And I remember the election in 1980. I was working, I don't remember where I was. I think I was working in Alney, Texas, in a hydraulic hose factory back then. Anyway, yeah, that's what I was. That was that hose factory. I got home and I said, everybody said it was going to be a very close election. And we may not know for a couple of days who wins because the polls were all indicating that it was just a real barn burner. And so I thought, well, I'm going to be up late watching the election results. I better take a nap because I'm going to watch these results as late as I can. I had to get up and go to work the next day, but I planned on staying up late. So I took a nap. I got up about 9 o'clock and it was already over. Carter had already conceded because it was such a rout. And that just goes to show you, back in 1980, the polls were wrong. In 2024, the polls were wrong again, right? It's nothing new that the media and the polling companies will kind of fudge the numbers in order to support who their candidate is. But yeah, 1980, Reagan defeated Carter in a landslide. And then 4 years later, he defeated Walter Mondale in a landslide. And so that's kind of the history of Carter's presidency. He was also, I just wanted to point out one other thing, is that Carter was also known as the guy who got deregulation through. Now, you may not care about deregulation, but deregulation was an important thing. And it had long-term consequences for Western civilization. It's just not one of those things people get excited talking about. But let's see, can you guys, yeah, you can see this. Jimmy Carter, the great regulator. Since he announced his plans to enter hospice care, tributes have begun to pour in for former President Carter. This was written a couple of months ago, I guess. President Carter faced many challenges during his presidency, including the Iranian hostage crisis, OPEC oil embargo, Nicaraguan revolution, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, a nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island, and runaway inflation. When President Carter took office in 1977, a multitude of new regulatory agencies, including the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, Federal Energy Administration, U.S. Consumer Product, were launching ambitious agendas. Traditional economic regulatory agencies such as Interstate Commerce Commission and Civil Aeronautics Board were also busy setting rates and conditions for trains, trucks, pipelines, buses, and airlines. Carter led the move toward deregulation, which promoted competition. And competition brings better products, better services, and lower prices. I am a free trade guy. That's, Reagan was a free trade guy. That's one of the things I liked about him. I believe in competition. And Carter promoted competition by deregulating the airline industry, the trucking industry, and years later, we saw the deregulation of the telecommunications industry, which allowed for the implementation of the World Wide Web. It wouldn't have happened without deregulation. And if you might remember Al Gore, they say that Al Gore claimed that he invented the internet. No, actually, what Al Gore said was that when he was in Congress, he took the lead in creating the internet. Now, what he meant was he was pushing for deregulation of the telecommunications industry so that we could implement the World Wide Web in the United States like they had already done in Europe. And then most people didn't know about the World Wide Web. They'd never heard of it. But Al Gore knew about it, and he knew that it was a good thing. And he said, let's do that here. We had to have deregulation of telecommunications before we could do that. If you remember the breakup of the monopoly of Ma Bell, and they created all these baby bells and everything. But that move toward deregulation actually started with Jimmy Carter. So I'll give him credit for that, and I'll give him credit for the Camp David Accords. Otherwise, I think his presidency was pretty much a failure. And so, and most people perceived Carter that way. And so, since he became a former president, he pretty much over the last 44 years set out to salvage his legacy and reinvent himself. And he started doing this Habitat for Humanity thing. I never heard of Habitat for Humanity. Most people hadn't. But because he was a former president, he got a lot of press. And he went out there and he started encouraging people to do community service and build houses for the less fortunate. And that was a good thing. I think it's the greatest thing that he did as a former president is encourage people to be involved in their communities and to care for the less fortunate. And Habitat for Humanity represented that. But at the same time, Carter ticked off a lot of people. Carter, and not just Republicans. He and Bill Clinton, a lot of people don't know this, but he and Bill Clinton had a long, ongoing feud for years. They wouldn't even talk to each other. You see them at a lot of political events where they're standing next to each other. Clinton's looking away. Hi, how y'all doing? And Carter's looking this way. They're not even making eye contact. They couldn't stand each other. Because Carter broke with tradition and criticized his predecessors or his successors. There's been this long-standing tradition that former presidents don't criticize their successors, because they know how hard the job is. Well, Carter broke with that tradition. He just criticized Reagan, Bush Sr., Clinton, George W. Bush. I think he even criticized Obama, the darling of the Democrat Party. And of course, he criticized Trump. And so it kind of endeared him to a lot of people, but it also offended a lot of people that he would do that. I mean, he was very opinionated, and he had a tendency to just say what was on his mind. And so he's kind of got a mixed legacy among people in Washington who know about Jimmy Carter. Washington never really liked Jimmy Carter. He was an outsider. He was from Plains, Georgia. And as odd as it may seem, Ronald Reagan was very popular in Washington because he was a movie star and he was governor of California. He was popular with the Washington establishment because he was used to hanging out with rich people and fancy occasions and everything. Jimmy Carter, he went into the White House and he put solar panels on the White House. And the Washington establishment said, that is tacky, putting solar panels on the, well, he believed in solar energy, And when Reagan took over, he took those solar panels down. He said, get that out of here. Rosalind Carter would never do anything to update anything at the White House. She said that we don't want to waste the American taxpayers' money. Then Nancy Reagan came in and she just redid everything. So anyway, that's pretty much all I wanted to cover. There was one other little thing that I thought I'd throw in, is that when Carter was always a big civil rights advocate, but when he was running for governor in 1970, he appealed to George Wallace followers, segregationists, and he used some very underhanded techniques in getting support from Wallace followers, including he circulated photos of his opponent hanging out with a black basketball team. And this is 1970. The country has changed a lot since then, but everybody knew what that meant back then. He was appealing to racists, to segregationists, to get the vote. Once he became governor, he governed as a liberal, or as a moderate at least, and as a civil rights advocate. But while he was campaigning, he needed those votes. And so he did some kind of tacky things to get segregationist votes to become governor, which they all do this. They all do stuff like that. And I'm not knocking Carter. I'm just saying he was a politician. Let's be realistic. He did do things like a politician in order to get votes. But he also did a lot of good things to promote equality, charity, and humanitarianism. So it's kind of a mixed legacy as far as I'm concerned. As far as other people concerned, the man was a saint, an angel, the greatest president ever. I don't think so. I think he did good things, but overall his presidency was a failure. So that's all I had to say about all that. I appreciate you guys bearing with me for half an hour now. Let me get back to the chat box here and see what folks are saying. We don't have a big turnout tonight, which I didn't expect because I'm talking about politics. Oh, let's see. Nixon tainted the memory of my presidential fitness award. I don't know what that means. JFK had a physical fitness program. Maybe that's what you're referring to. I don't know. Let's see. Jimmy Carter confessed that he lusted, a controversy back then. Yeah, they asked him if he had committed adultery, and he says, well, no, not really. But the Bible says if you've lusted after a woman, you committed adultery in your heart, and I am guilty of that. And most people had never heard that before because most people never read the Bible. But Jimmy Carter had read the Bible, and he was just being honest. Jesus said lust is adultery. You don't have to do the physical act of adultery. Just lusting after a woman, it means you've already broken the law. And so Jimmy Carter pled guilty to that. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's biblical. Get a new fitness award from Biden. It might or might not be in the mail, depending on if you remember to put a stamp on the envelope. Let's see. The debate between Reagan and Carter was more polite and decent than debates in recent years. I don't know. It depends on which debate. If you're talking about Trump and Hillary, Trump and Biden, yeah, Trump is a contentious guy, and so his debates are kind of nasty. Let's see, Bush and Gore, that got kind of heated. But the vice presidential debates between Dick Cheney and Joe Lieberman, that was considered one of the most civil debates that we've ever seen in modern history. And a lot of people after that debate, they said those guys should be at the head of the ticket instead of Bush and Gore. No scandals from Carter, but he confessed that he had lusted, and that was wrong. Don't you wish that was the only sin going on with other politicians? Amen. But here's the thing with Carter. Carter said, I'm not going to lie to you. And Carter had no scandals. And he was a, Bible teacher, Sunday school teacher, and a humanitarian and everything. But his presidency was considered a failure. And then you got a guy like Trump, who doesn't seem to have that kind of character, been married 3 times, has lied about a lot of stuff. He calls it exaggeration, or I guess, what's the other word that he uses? It's not coming to me at the moment, but it's not fabrication. Anyway, it's just part of his philosophy is that you exaggerate in order to get the deal, and then once you get the deal, you work real hard to deliver a great product. It's just always been part of his philosophy. But yeah, you've had Reagan was married twice. Gore ended up getting divorced, but that was after his presidency. You had Clinton and his escapades. Barack Obama, as far as I'm concerned, committed an impeachable offense when he used the IRS to go after his political opponents. That's an impeachable offense, but nobody ever brought impeachment charges against him. But yeah, character-wise, Carter, I think, was superior to any president we've had since then. But competency, he just didn't seem to be able to get things done, except, like I said, deregulation and the Camp David Accords. Reagan had the best jokes. Yeah, when Reagan was shot, I remember and they brought him into surgery because he had a bullet lodged in his chest somewhere. And the surgeon started to put him under, and he said, "Please tell me you're a Republican." That was pretty funny. And the fact of the matter is, his surgeon was a lifelong Democrat, but that doesn't matter when you're doing your job. You have to treat a Republican president just like you would a Democrat president. If you eat the Kamala word salad, you are what you eat. Not even the pollster is excluded. Okay, I guess he's talking about when I was talking about the polls being wrong back in 1980, and they're still wrong today. Al Gore was known to be a little stiff in his presentations. Yeah, Al Gore was not people just didn't care for his personality. He came across as the smartest kid in the class that was always trying to educate everybody. And, it didn't take much to be the smartest kid in the class when you're up against George W. Bush. He should have used a little more personality and a little less ego. Does anyone remember the long distance companies dial up on long distance? Yeah, I was thinking about that the other day. The days of, I remember, of course, the days of the rotary phones when I was a kid. And when I was real little, you had to call the operator to make a long distance call. It's just like on Mayberry, the Andy Griffith Show. You had to call Sarah and say, "Put me through." And then we had what was called direct dialing. Oh, direct dialing, man. You don't have to go through the operator anymore. And then we had push button dialing. You don't have to dial the rotary on a rotary phone anymore. And then the breakup of the telecommunications industry and Ma Bell and monopoly and all that. And then cell phones came out, flip phones, and it's just amazing how far we've come in my lifetime as far as communications is concerned. Carter never criticized the Atlanta Braves. No, the Braves, the Hawks, the Falcons, you can't touch the local team when you're a politician. You got to support the team that your community supports. Oh, Billy Beer. I was going to mention that. Thank you, Mark, for mentioning that. Billy Beer. Jimmy Carter had a brother named Billy. And Jimmy was a really ambitious guy. I mean, he went off to the Navy, and then he studied nuclear physics, and then he built this peanut business. He was a very successful guy before he ever got into politics. His brother Billy was just like, the black sheep of the family. Billy was a drunk. I think he died when he was 51. He had a drinking problem, and he just, I think, pretty much just drank himself to death. Carter also had a sister named Ruth Carter Stapleton, If you're old enough, you might remember Ruth Carter Stapleton was a faith healer. And back in that day, there was a big emphasis on inner healing. And so she was an inner healing faith healer. And she brought in a lot of new age concepts and stuff like that. And that was very common back in the 70s. A lot of churches kind of merged new thought, new age concepts into healing. And we've done a good job over the past 45 years of separating what the Bible says from what New Age says. But back then it was kind of all lumped together. I remember my family in the Baptist church. My mom was into Edgar Casey. My sister was into astrology, and they didn't know any better. Nobody was teaching against it in the church back then. Now, eventually the church caught on. We got to educate people about counter cult apologetics. But yeah, Ruth Carter Stapleton. I remember comedians making jokes about Jimmy Carter's family. What a weird family. He's got a brother promoting Billy beer. I guess Billy figured, if there's anything I know about, it's beer. So he started a beer company. And if you've got any Billy beer now, it's worth a lot of money because it didn't stay in business long. And then his Ruth Carter Stapleton, she was just considered a whack job. A lot of people tried to make her look more legitimate, but if you ever listen to her very much, in her healing, she tried to make Jesus's healing ministry about inner healing. And anyway, yeah, I could have gotten off into all the strange stuff about Carter's family, but he was a president. He was a leader. He influenced our culture, especially, like I said, as far as deregulation. Back when I was a kid, flying was expensive. Most people did not fly, not because they were afraid, but because the airline industry just was not set up to handle the regular American. They catered to the wealthy. But eventually, airplane fares came down to the point that just about anybody could fly if they wanted to. If they had a job, they could save up a little money, you could buy a plane ticket. It just became so much more competitive to where the rates came down, the service went up. So Carter gave us that through deregulation and other industries that eventually were deregulated as well. And that's all contributed to the economic expansion over the past 40 years. Did the Green Acres phone call climb up the pole to make a call? Oh, Rod did the green. I thought you were asking a question. Did Green Acres phone call climb up the? I don't know of anybody that ever did that, but I guess they had to in some rural areas. But you did have to dial 0 to get the operator to make a long distance call until late 60s. I'm old enough to remember that. You were very charitable explaining Al Gore's internet remarks. Well spoken. Well, thank you. Yeah, a lot of Republicans trashed him over that, and I thought, no, see, I have a background in IT, and I've studied the internet for years. The internet has actually been around since the 60s. It was originally called ARPANET, but you could only talk to people in your domain back then. Government people could talk to government people, educational people could talk to education, business people could talk to business people, science people could talk to science people, but they couldn't communicate cross-platform until the World Wide Web was implemented around 1989. And Al Gore in Congress was a big proponent of the World Wide Web. Let's deregulate telecommunications so that we can use the World Wide Web. I'll give credit where credit is due. I'm not a big fan of Al Gore, but what he did there was right. We are benefiting today from people like Al Gore who pushed for deregulation of telecommunications 35 years ago. So, I don't like partisan politics. Clinton did things that I think were good, like midnight basketball. Republicans, like I remember Rush Limbaugh went on and on about how stupid midnight basketball was. Midnight basketball was not Clinton's idea. It was a program that had already been initiated in Florida, and it worked very well. And Clinton just wanted to take that nationwide as a way of getting inner city youth off the streets at night, get them into a gymnasium where they can be supervised by adults and they can play basketball instead of being out on the streets getting into trouble. What's wrong with that? I thought it was a good idea. I don't care if it's Clinton's idea. Clinton was also for school uniforms. I think that's a good idea. Why should kids be able to dress, pants hanging down their butt and, gang outfits and stuff? Why should kids be able to dress that way? Why not have everybody? They do it in England. In England, a lot of schools, you have a dress code. You have to dress according to the school's requirements. I don't see anything wrong with having school uniforms or anything wrong with midnight basketball. And those were Democrat initiatives. And I think some Republican ideas are stupid. This is why I don't consider myself a Republican anymore. I consider myself an independent. But yeah, Al Gore had some good ideas, but he's also got some stupid ideas. Let's see. Anyone remember the odd even gas days, supposedly the gas oil crisis? Yeah, I remember when I was a kid, we were told that we were running out of gas. We're running out of oil. There's a shortage of oil. We all got to cut back on our oil consumption. There was not a shortage of oil. There was a shortage of oil that was being sold to the United States because of the Arab oil embargo. It was politics. It was geopolitics. We got plenty of oil. We're not running out. We just had a mismanaged government that left us with not enough oil. And so we all started cutting back. But the thing was, we just needed to negotiate with OPEC nations. There was no shortage. And there was no shortage even here. It was a lot, because I grew up in Texas. There's lots of oil fields in Texas, but a lot of those wildcats, we call them those oil derricks, they're called wildcats. A lot of them were capped. They weren't even pumping oil out because the price wasn't high enough. And then once the Arab oil embargo hit and we had a shortage, the price went up. These guys said, hot dang, let's start drilling. Let's start pumping that oil out because we can get enough money for it now. So the oil was there. The derricks were there. They just weren't pumping because it wasn't profitable enough. Let's see. I remember seeing pictures of Carter wearing bell bottoms. I don't remember that. I wouldn't be surprised because that was the style back in the late 60s, early 70s. And that was when Carter was governor. So he was well known back then. So, well, looks like we've only got, what do we have here? About 16 people. I knew we weren't going to have a big turnout. Jimmy Carter isn't the topic everybody wants to discuss right now. I don't care. I think when a guy passes, a former president passes like that, I think it's something worth talking about. It's part of our history. I think it's important to educate people about our history and get the facts regarding what happened 40 or 50 years ago. And so, yeah, I'm not going to get a lot of views on this thing, but so what? One of the nice things about getting older is you just don't care as much. You just don't care what people think. The things that I thought were so important 40 years ago, I don't care about anymore. I wanted to be a recording artist. I was a songwriter and a musician. I wanted to be a recording artist. I couldn't care less now about that. I hardly ever play music anymore because I'm focused on what I'm doing here, So your priorities change as you get older. I'm not really focused on having the biggest YouTube channel. I want to talk about what I want to talk about, what I think is important to talk about. If Melissa used dial-up GPS to navigate through Dallas, would she have made it on time? Interesting. I don't know if she used GPS or Google Maps. I don't know what she did. but I'm almost certain she flew on Southwest Airlines because there's no other reason to be in Dallas. She said, Dallas, your roads are ridiculous. What are you doing in Dallas, girl? Kenneth Copeland's convention's in downtown Fort Worth. The only reason she would have been there, as far as I can see, unless she was somewhere else and then came in from the east. But even then, why not fly into DFW? And then at that point, she was having trouble with the roads in Dallas. I don't, I shouldn't be making fun. I would be disoriented. But see, the thing is, I grew up reading maps. We didn't have Google Maps or GPS until I was 50 years old. And younger people get so conditioned to using calculators to do math and GPS to navigate, they don't know how to read a map. Some of them, I'm not saying that's the case with Melissa, but it might be. That might be the case. I know that there's a lot of young people that do not read maps. They just punch in, here's where I am and here's where I'm going. Tell me how to get there. And turn right in 3/4 of a mile, oh, you missed your exit, recalculating. They don't know how to read a map. And all you got to do is look at that. I look at Google Maps, but I don't get directions from Google Maps. I just look at the map and say, okay, I just take this road down here and then I go that way. Real simple. And I do math in my head too. I mean, I can use a calculator. I know how to do it, but I also know my multiplication tables and basic math. And I can also write in longhand. I'm told that they don't teach that anymore. Cursive. I don't know. This is what it's like to be old. It's all these things that I took for granted back then. Now kids aren't being taught these things. Do you think Tulsi Gabbard will be America's first woman president? I think it's possible. I don't think she could have won as a Democrat, but now that she's a Republican, I think it's possible. And I would vote for her. I mean, I would probably vote for somebody else for the nomination before I would vote for her, because she still has some kind of liberal domestic policies. But, she's ex-military. Yeah. I guess not military. What was she in? The National Guard, something. But I think it's very possible. I don't see any way a woman Democrat would win, because that's the big knock. I said this before. That's the big knock against women presidents, is that they would probably not be real strong on national security. That's the reason that Hillary always came across as a hawk, because she had to in order to get votes. If she was perceived as being weak on terrorism, weak on communism, whatever, she knew that she wouldn't get votes. And Bill Clinton knew that, and he was her advisor. So Hillary, she won the popular vote. She lost the electoral vote, which is really the only one that counts. Kamala didn't even win the popular vote. So there's a few other women in the Republican Party that I think are worth looking at, but I don't know, like Condoleezza Rice. I like her okay. I mean, she is a little bit of a neocon, but I think I'd vote for her if she was the Republican nominee. What are your thoughts on Copeland's covenant with God to live to be 120, thinking of centurions? I actually did a video about this a couple of years ago when Copeland said he was going to live to be 120. I did a video and said, no, you're not. I'm just going to flat out tell you, his interpretation of Genesis 6:3 is that man's years would be 120. But people still lived beyond 120 years after that. That's not talking about longevity. It was talking about the length of time until the flood. I don't believe Kenneth Copeland will make it to 120. I don't believe he'll make it to 110. It's possible he'll make it to 100. 1 in 1,000 do. But I think that's the number that I looked it up one time. My dad made it to 91, and I think I was researching it about that time. But Copeland has kept his weight down through the years, and he exercises. He's taken pretty good care of himself. It's possible he'll make it to 100, but he's not going to make it to 110 or 120. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But if he makes it to 120, I'll be gone by then. So I won't have to eat my words because I don't want to live to be 120. I saw my grandpa at 93 and I saw my dad at 91. And I think 90 years is a nice number to, wrap it all up. National Guard is the military. Plenty of them have seen combat in our most recent wars. Okay, I guess technically you're right. When I think of the military, I think of the Army, the Navy, and the Marines. And the National Guard, I don't know. I don't know how it fits into that. But I do know that when you're in the National Guard, you have a regular job. When you're in the military, that's your job. So, and then you get called up in the National Guard and your job is suspended because you have to go and serve. Whereas if you're in the Army or the Navy or the Air Force, Marines, that is your job. So I guess that's the distinction that I'm making. Copeland still wants to see some great move of God, I suppose. Well, yeah, we all do. But, to me, it's just a matter of interpreting the Bible properly. Genesis 6:3 is not talking about longevity. And there are people who make it to 120 or beyond. There are, in the Guinness Book of World Records, I think people have lived to be like 123, 124. But what's the quality of life once you get up to 110? But no, I don't think Copeland's going to make it to 120. And I disagree with Kenneth Copeland on a lot of things. But I don't comment on everything that he said because I'd have very little else to do if I were to go that route. Kids today can't read an analog clock. Is that true? They can only read digital clocks? If a person writes in cursive, will that be considered in the future as a generational curse? Oh, cursive. That's a play on words, I guess. It's a generational cursive. Let's see. Way back in the day, the internet used bulletin boards, modern dial into the web page. Yeah, bulletin boards were how people communicated in the early days of the World Wide Web because computers had like 4 meg of RAM. I remember my first computer had 4 meg of RAM. You're not going to watch videos with 4 meg of RAM and 120, I think it was 129 meg of hard drive space. We've come a long way. Back the earlier PCs were designed for text. They were text based, and that was all that people thought we would ever use them for. Until they started building these beefy processors up to handle a lot more data. Jean Calment lived to 122. She actually met Van Gogh. She said he was not a pleasant person to be around. Well, he was nuts. I mean, he was a genius, but he was kind of nuts too. Didn't he cut his ear off? I remember the movie. I think it was Kirk. Was it Kirk Douglas? That he put his hand over the flame, and he was burning his hand. He said, "I want to see your daughter. I'm gonna hold my hand over this candle until she comes out." And he actually burned the flesh on his hand, and he wouldn't remove his hand. He was nuts. So I wouldn't be surprised if he was unpleasant to be around. Let's see. I got 14 people here. That's a far cry from what I had a few weeks ago. I had 700 people in here when I was talking about Daystar. That shows you what people want to talk about. I just got tired of talking about Daystar. I don't want to do more Daystar videos, but I mean, yeah, I'll get a lot of views and everything, but it's so sad what has happened. I mean, that is an organization that was being used of God, but apparently they were doing a lot of things in a very corrupt manner, and it's turned into a real circus. They had this one guy, Tom Callender, who was telling Jonathan, it's in the recording. He says, Jonathan, you need to sign that there NDA. You don't sign that thing, you're out of here, boy. If it was up to me, you'd already be gone. But your mama wanted me to give you one last chance to do the right thing. So I'm pleading with you, boy. Sign the NDA or you out of here. And now they've got this guy, Steve Wilhite, I think is his name. He came out and did a video the other day talking about Laura Lynn Tyler Thomas, who has done a lot of videos on Daystar. And that guy to me sounds like Hank Hill. I sell propane and propane accessories. This guy is, to me, I mean, he's a stereotypical Texan. He's about as Texan as he can be. He says, I sell Daystar and Daystar accessories. And it was a disaster. He came out and did this attack job on Laura Lynn Tyler Thomas, and people just laughed at him. He called her a clickbait cockroach. And so she changed her, what do you call it? Her little icon to it was like an AI version of a female cockroach. People are making fun of him. I mean, it was just a PR disaster for Daystar to send that guy out there. They thought that was a good idea, I guess, but it's just turned into a complete circus. And a lot of people are doing videos about it, and more power to them. I get tired of this stuff after a while. I am going to do a video on Dr. Michael Brown. I think it's important for people to know what's going on there. But I just don't like to talk about these things that much. I want to talk about something else. Yeah, it's a real clown show. I mean, I expect a clown car to come out and a juggler on a unicycle. It's Daystar. It's such a joke at this point. Let's see. I know many people who are alive today under the age of 100. Many are not pleasant to be around. Yeah, people think sometimes that old people are nice. And if you've been in a nursing home like I have, when I had to put my dad in a nursing home, some of those people are mean, angry. They don't want to be there. They're losing their minds, so their cognitive skills are not that good. They accuse everybody of lying and trying to steal from them. Hats off to anybody who works with the elderly. Now, I'm not saying they're all like that. There's a lot of really sweet old people. They've lived out their lives. They've got the kids, the grandkids, great-grandkids, and they're just biding their time until they die. But then there's people who they were angry when they were young, and they're angry when they're old. And my dad was one of those. So it's it's a lot to take care of an elderly person in their declining years. I had to help Dad out for a couple of years, but I also had to have him put into a nursing home because it was beyond my ability to, do all the things. Make sure he takes his medicine, make sure he eats, does physical therapy and all that. Since you're from Texas, have you ever met anyone that talks like Boomhauer? Okay, is Boomhauer the guy that mumbles? Because if that's who Boomhauer is, yes, I have. I have heard Texans say, "I don't want that dang thing." Yeah, you name it, I've seen it. I've seen Texans that are smooth talkers like Ross Perot, H. Ross Perot. Boy, that guy was a talker. Cut and dry, pure and simple, end of story. Let me tell you what, folks, this is just the way it is. There's fast-talking Texans, and then there's slow-talking Texans like LBJ. There's Texans that mumble. There are Texans that don't have a Texas accent, and they're very articulate. Dan Rather was from Texas. And he had a little bit of a Texas accent, but for the most part, he talked like a broadcaster. I talk like Boomhauer all the time. Um, yeah, I'm not a big fan of Hank of the Hill, but I have watched it a few times, and that one line about propane and propane accessories, that's funny because there are a lot of people in Texas that are into propane and butane. And I just never really liked the idea of working with natural gas. It's just not what I'm used to. I prefer liquid gas or electric to uh, natural gas, but that's me. It's all in what you're used to, I guess. Well, we've been going for over an hour now, and my rear end's getting sore. My throat's getting a little sore. So I'm going to wrap it up here. I'll take one more. People need not overload on Daystar. We Christians need to remember Philippians 4:8 and live by it. I don't know if that's the verse about whatsoever things are lovely and true, think on these things. Is that what Philippians 4:8 is about? If true. And good to see you, Gary, by the way. Always good to see Gary. Yeah, we do tend in the church world to gravitate toward gossip and the salacious, and we shouldn't. I mean, some of these things are important. You have to talk about them, like SA. We do need to have a zero tolerance policy when it comes to assault within the church. Church hurt. Those things are not just sinful, they're criminal. And we need to talk about those kind of things. And we need to talk about responsibility, fiscal responsibility with ministries. We need to talk about ethics. But do we need to be into every little salacious detail about somebody's personal life? I'd rather not go into it that far. Just, only what you need to know to address the biblical issue and principles involved. So, okay. Well, thanks for joining me. I know this isn't the kind of stuff that I usually talk about, but hopefully you got something out of this. Every president is going to have his strengths and weaknesses, and they're all human, and they're all going to be accountable to their creator. They're all going to have to bend their knee and confess Jesus as Lord. Whether you're the president or whether you're a plumber or a pauper, we all have accountability to our creator, to a sovereign God. We all have to come through the cross and be born again to enter the kingdom of God. And whether you're a president or not, you have that accountability. And a lot of presidents, I guess most presidents, are going to acknowledge their need for faith in God. But the way that some of them live, you wonder if they really believe in God. And so anyway, but the Bible does say give honor where honor is due. And I think honor is due to Jimmy Carter in some respects. And then in other respects, a little criticism is justified. Maybe we can learn from his mistakes on economics or his mistakes on foreign policy. But, we take advantage of this occasion. I think the funeral's tomorrow, to honor the man that served his country, not just as president, but also as a governor and also in the service, in the military service. So, but you don't need to be unrealistic and pretend that they could do no wrong. And that was the main thing that I wanted to point out. So thanks for joining me, everybody. Next week, we'll get into something a little more theological, hopefully. I'm looking forward to a good 2025, a good year of growth, productivity. I'll keep you apprised of things that we're doing. There's a project I'm involved in right now that you'll probably be hearing about in a few months. And I'm not at liberty to talk about it right now, but there's some things happening that I'll eventually reveal to everybody. So everybody have a good night. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you in the next live stream. Good night.